We're now into the second week for our mosaics and panoramas, and this time we'll talk about, now that you have it shot, how do you put it all together? So the first thing we'll do is go through this quick PowerPoint to let you read about and think about the steps involved, some of your options, and then we'll do a demo putting one together so you can see how it's done fairly simply if you have a small one. So let's get this underway. Basic workflow is going to be having to pre-process these files, and we're going to have to deal with them in several steps because they all have to match. I can't overemphasize it enough that these files have got to match each other. So let's start with the monitor calibrations. This has nothing to do with stitching. It has everything to do with setting up your system. If you haven't done this, now is the time. And part of the problem, or part of the reason, is so that as we work, we can, whether you're doing the printing or you're having somebody else do the printing in an open system, you can print what you see on the file. If you have a little file and it goes bad in the printing, it's not that expensive to make an adjustment and do it again. But if you're going to be making a huge file, it's really expensive to screw up the print. So you really want to make sure that it's printing what you see. And that means what you see on your monitor has got to be calibrated, has got to be accurate. So it'll save you paper, it'll save you time. It's just absolutely worth doing. If you're going to have to make any corrections, if you shot it raw, and if the raw converter allows, remember, again, and I'm going to repeat this over and over, all of your shots when you're ready to stitch them must match. So if you're going to do corrections, and here are areas where you may want to make some corrections, you must do it to all of them. You must apply the same correction to every frame that you're doing to all of them, or they won't match. If you shot them as JPEGs, which I would suggest you don't do, but if you do, lock all of the settings down. Shoot it manually, lock them all down. We talked about this in the last section, but again, your life is going to be miserable if your images don't match. So some of the conversion settings when you make this conversion from RAW, if you're going through that whole process in ACR or doing it out of Bridge, then your color space ought to be ProPhoto or Adobe. You want as much color as you can get. I mean, we're going for the gold here. You're going for the highest quality you can get. So make sure everything matches that. Bit depth ought to be 16. It's going to take up more space, but as we get into editing it, then it's going to give you a little more editing flexibility. Format, PSD is a good file, and PSD also has a large format version, which is what you're probably going to use. TIFF is too huge to deal with, and JPEG you should stay away from until you're ready for the final output file for some purpose. Your master file should be a PSD or a large format Photoshop file. Resolution, base it on your printer. If you have an Epson, make it 360 ppi. If you have anything else, make it 300 ppi. That can get confusing, but different printers have different engines that drive them, and that's the basic breakdown. There's Epson and pretty much everyone else. So these are the best settings to get you the best resolution output. Now it's going to come time to stitch it, and we have some options. One is you can do it manually. You can bring all of these files individually into Photoshop, create an underlying big canvas, lay them down, and start moving them around and blending them. You're going to have a huge issue with lens distortion that you're going to have to take out. That's going to take you some time. This is going to be incredibly labor intensive. But Photoshop has another option. It has an auto blend option, and that's what we're going to use in the demo. It's easy to use, and if you have a fairly simple mosaic, maybe 9 up to 15 shots, Photoshop can do as good a job as anyone else. It doesn't have other options that some of the other stitchers have, but it will work. You already have it, so it's a good place for you to start. But let's look at some other software options, just so you're aware of them. There's an underlying function called Panotools. It was written by a mathematician, and it requires somebody who could launch a space shuttle to make sense of it. But fortunately, a couple of different photographers who like working with mosaics and multi-row pans created interfaces for it. One of them is called PT Assembler, and the PT comes from Panotools. It's inexpensive. It's $50 to register it, although there is a free trial. And it's fast. It's cheap. It doesn't have the functionality that PT GUI, which stands for Panotools Graphical User Interface. That's more expensive. It's $153 to register. But it's very fast, almost automatic in everything it does. If you do a lot of these, if you really get into this high-resolution mosaic or do a lot of panoramas, PT GUI might be your program. Might certainly be worth looking at. There are other stitchers out there. When you look at them, when you go online and read about them, make sure that they have multi-row capability. There are a number of stitchers out there that will deal with a single row panorama, but will choke when it gets to that second row. It can't match it up on the far end, and it doesn't know what to do with it, so it just chokes. Make sure that it will deal with multi-row. Then you run the software. You stitch it together. Your big issue then is going to be, what do you do with the output file? And you've got options. You can play with most of these with pixel dimension. I usually just leave it at the native size to begin with, although it's huge. Sit back and wait between functions, but I don't want to diminish that until I have to. File type, again, I would use Photoshop. If you have done this manually, it's going to be layered. Do not flatten it until you have all of the issues worked out about blending and aligning all of the layers. Go over it with a fine-tooth comb before you flatten it, because once you flatten it, it's done, and now you're into tedious cloning and patching and all kinds of stuff to try to get things to match if they didn't in the first place. So the large format Photoshop file as a layered file is a good one for this. Color space, again, leave it in Adobe or ProPhoto. File resolution, if it came out something different, I don't know why it should, but maybe some of the stitchers changed that. Make sure that it's set to your printer resolution. Name conventions, file number 1, I just give it a name, whatever the name of the finished thing is going to be, and put mosaic number 1 or edit number 1, state number 1, something to say this is the first stitch together, and save that, because you don't want to have to go through all the stitching again if for some reason you should need to get back and start at this point again. Okay, once it's stitched, now we're going to do some preliminary work in the editor. The following sequence is somewhat image specific, so it may vary a little bit depending on the image. We've already saved that first assembled file, number 1. Now, you may have to crop out or use the perspective tool to remove any projection distortion. Lens distortion function can help a little here. Depending on how many pieces you have and what lens you shot them with, you may get virtually no distortion, Or you may have something that looks like a Mercator projection of a map, and you've got to trim off a lot of stuff. So the first thing to do will be to get rid of that, and the simplest way generally is by cropping. That's going to get rid of all these little projected fringe areas, make your life a whole lot easier. Again, should still be in layers, so make sure you have fixed all of the seams and the blending issues. Now you can flatten it if it's still in layers. And once it's flattened, adjust the resolution again if you have to, if it isn't right, and save as file number 2. And this one I usually use the same name, call it number 2. I know that means that it's now stitched and preliminarily edited. It's a mid-stage file. But I want to keep it because now, again, if something happens, if I get a power outage, if something goes down, I can get back to this without having to redo all of this work. Now, we're going to process that final image. You're going to use a normal workflow. This is going to be a huge file, but you're going to use the normal workflow. Do tonalities, global tonalities, levels, and curves. Deal with color, global, photo filters, saturation, color balance, the same way you would work on any other normal file. Then we can go in and do the selective area or the local editing of different parts of it. And now we're going to save. This is going to be our master file. Save this at full size, and this will be the name, mosaic name number 3, or edit master. This will be the full size file. This one is going to be gold for you. You want to save this. If you have to change things for specific output, you do that, but you leave this master file alone. Now, what are you going to do with this gigantic file? Well, there are some special ways of viewing it on a computer. There is a piece of software called Zoomify that will allow you to go in and zoom in tightly on this on computer. On my website, there are some examples of this. You must have your Flash player activated to view these at the moment. But they'll let you zoom way, way, way into a picture and give you an example of how much there really is there to see. And that's all there is to it. Unless, of course, the reason you made this is for a giant print. Now, matting and framing or preparing a canvas wrap for a giant print is a whole new ball game. But that's going to have to wait for another discussion. So let's now take a look at putting one of these together as simply as possible using Photoshop. See you in the next presentation.